Hey there everyone, welcome back to Utility Sports. So excited for today's video. We're going to cover the Toronto Raptors, who have had kind of a disappointing start to the 2023-2024 NBA season. Following a disappointing season last year, there's a lot of speculation right now about the Toronto Raptors. Will they make some of their star players available? Yes, I'm talking about OG Anunoby. Yes, I'm talking about Pascal Siakam. Yes, I'm talking about a bevy of other players on this roster as well. Could it be a fire sale in Toronto? I know that's a little atypical from Masai Ujiri. We're going to discuss all of that and more in this video in what is our very first trade guide of the 2023-2024 NBA trade deadline season. We're past December 15th, one of the most important dates in the NBA, where most of the NBA becomes trade eligible. And because of that, trade speculation is ramping up. So if you guys do enjoy this video and want to see future content here at Utility Sports, make sure to leave a like. It lets me know I'm doing a good job. Subscribe to the channel for more content so you don't miss out on future uploads, future trade guides. We're going to try and cover all 30 teams. Last year, I think I recorded on 26, 27 different teams. This year, my plan is to hit all 30. Remember, we're going to be live during the trade deadline week as well. Every single little bit of content you need is going to be here at Utility Sports. So let's get into it now with our video preview. What exactly are we going to discuss in this video? First, we're going to look at the Raptors draft pick situation. One of the best things to do before you consider any type of trade is to see what the team has in terms of their draft picks. Do they control their picks? Does another team control their picks? Do they have assets to trade? Do they need more assets in their cupboard? We're going to talk about that with the Raptors and why I think that might come into play in this year's trade deadline for them specifically. Then we're also going to talk about the Raptors multi-year contract situation. The cap table often dictates what teams are trying to do. If they have a lot of good players under contract for a long time, well, typically those teams aren't going to be active. But Toronto might be a little bit different, so we'll see exactly what happens with them. We'll look at some of those tradable players that they do have, guys who are mostly on expiring contracts, and then we'll discuss finally at the end their direction and what does that long-term impact look like from the decisions that Masai Ujiri and the Raptors front office makes this season. There's a lot to break down in this video. I don't want to waste time, so let's get into it here now with those draft picks. What do they currently have and who's going to be throwing on future Toronto Raptors draft caps? Well, currently they owe this year's first round pick to the San Antonio Spurs. Now it is top 6 protected. With where the Raptors currently sit in the standings, that pick might end up being 8 or 9-ish is kind of where they're currently projected. I believe in the last mock draft that pick was around pick number 10. So you're looking at an asset that likely is going to convey if the Raptors stay exactly where they are. Now obviously the lottery could shake things up. It's possible we could see the Raptors move up. They moved up a few years ago when they got Scottie Barnes 4th overall. You never really know, but right now it looks like that pick might convey, which I think would actually be good for Toronto long term. Just based on this draft not being the strongest draft, and yes, it hurts to send an asset out the door, but there's backups on that pick through 2025 and 2026. So if it does not convey this year, it likely would end up conveying at some point in 2025 or 2026 in stronger draft classes, and that same top 6 protection applies in all 3 of those years. If it doesn't convey by 2026, it becomes a 2026 second rounder. While we're talking about second rounders, the Raptors currently owe their second rounder this year to the Los Angeles Clippers, and they also owe their 2025 second rounder to the Dallas Mavericks. So right now, there are some kind of close proximity assets that they have sent out the door. The one sent to the Spurs was from the Acapulco trade. You're also missing a couple of second round picks. But otherwise, they do own all of their own draft assets. So maybe if that pick conveys this year to San Antonio, you're kind of looking at a reshuffled deck here for the Raptors where they have their own draft picks to trade. They have a lot of flexibility. And because of that, there's multiple ways that they could look to operate in the short and long term, which I think is really important for them. Now let's get into notable player contracts, and a lot of these guys are expiring contracts. Pascal Siakam, he's in the final year of his deal, $38 million. Now listen, I know he's an all-NBA caliber player. He's a really good talent. And it's hard to see a player like that leave your organization. You never want to lose out on talent in the NBA. But the Raptors run the risk of losing some of these guys for nothing, and so does a team that trades for them. So when it comes to receiving value for a guy like Pascal Siakam, you're probably not going to get the same amount of value you would have if you traded him a year ago. A team trading for Pascal Siakam has to acknowledge the risk that, hey, if we trade for him in February, it's possible he's signing a contract with a new team in June or July. So because of that, is he a 3 or 4 month rental? And if that's the case, his value is a little bit less. The same could be true for OG Anunoby, who is essentially in the final year of his contract, a little bit over $18.5 million. He does have a player option for next year, but there is no chance he opts into that. He will decline it, and he will likely get paid a ton this offseason by really a number of teams will be interested in him, both in free agency and at the trade deadline, if the Raptors do make him available to be had. Gary Trent Jr., final year of his contract, over $18.5 million as well. I think a player that a lot of teams should be interested in. He's in his mid-20s. We'll talk about him a little bit later on in this video, but I think he's a talent that, yes, sometimes when he's not shooting the ball super well, it's offensively he's a little limited, but he's a guy who's scored into the deep teens multiple times in his career. So I think you're looking at a guy who could really help a bunch of teams. Otto Porter Jr. and Thad Young, I have asterisks next to their name here on the graphic for a couple of reasons. First of all, they're both cheap and affordable for other teams to go get, and I think that they are likely trade candidates. Otto Porter Jr., if I had to pinpoint one team to look at acquiring him right now, I would point to the Golden State Warriors, who had him before he went to Toronto. He was, of course, a big part of the team that won the title in 2022, and I think returning to Golden State would not only be good for Otto Porter Jr. himself, but I think it would also be really good for the Warriors, who need kind of another wing on that roster who is an NBA vet caliber player. And at $6.3 million, it's pretty easy to work out a deal. Now, he is just into his early 30s. So Toronto, if they do pivot and build their roster around Scotty Barnes, who has been super excellent this year, he's just been so dominant. Scotty Barnes have been really impressed with him. Otto Porter Jr. is not a guy who doesn't fit that because he is in his early 30s. We're starting to see more players play deep into their 30s. Is Otto Porter Jr. one of those guys? I don't essentially know that, but I think that potentially he could be. So if you're the Raptors, you just don't give him away for nothing, but it's about getting some assets back in the door. Thad Young, he is into his mid to late 30s. He's someone, if you get like a protected second round pick for, I think that's okay. If you ultimately define that you are rebuilding, I think that's not a terrible option. Jakob Poeltl, I do not think he'll get traded. I do think his contract is notable though. He's in the first year of essentially a 4-year contract. There's a player option on that final year, and it's roughly $78 million in total. So you're looking at a big who probably is around the 15th to 20th best center in the NBA on any given night. With how much parity there is in the league, player rankings aren't really the best thing. The guy could play like the 12th best center one night, play like the 21st best center the second night. The player rankings aren't the best way to look at things, but really what I'm saying here is he's not an all-star caliber center. He's not an all-NBA caliber center, obviously, and he's making nearly $20 million a year, which is a pretty good amount of the cap to commit to a guy who is pretty one-dimensional on both sides of the ball. He's mostly a drop coverage big, and offensively doesn't stretch the floor a ton. Now, I think he's a solid passer. He gives you, really good rebounding on both ends of the. He's not a bad player by any means, but it is a lot of your cap to kind of send to one guy who is a little limited with his skill set. And one thing I do want to note, if the Raptors were to trade or lose all of their expiring contracts, they could be positioned to have roughly $80 million in cap space this offseason. Will they operate that way? My expectation would be no, and I don't really see a reason for them to. I'm not sure how many players you can convince to come to Toronto over other markets in the NBA. I'm not exactly sure if that's really the direction that they're going to operate with. That also would include a guy like, Precious Achiuwa, who I know that they do not want to lose. I mean, there's valuable players that this team has that they're going to want to keep restricted free agents. So I don't see them operating that way, but it's possible that if they trade or lose 1 or 2 or 3 of these guys that are on their final years of contracts, maybe it's not $80 million in cap space, but maybe it's 30, and then you can go out and still look to improve the team in that regard. Then when it comes to our first tradable player I really want to talk about, it is Pascal Siakam. I think the potential return for him is significantly less than what it would have been a year ago had they really considered trading him. And listen, a year ago I thought they were going to entertain trades for OG Anunoby and for Pascal Siakam and for Fred VanVleet, just with how disappointing their year was last year. But they didn't do that. They ended up pivoting, trading for Jakob Poeltl, and it really didn't move the needle for them. So now a year later, the question is, does Masai Ujiri choose that direction or not? If they do look to trade Pascal Siakam, what I think they could potentially get back is roughly 2 first-round picks of value, a good young player, and salary filler. Some teams I see interested would be Atlanta, Indiana, Sacramento, Dallas, and the Los Angeles Lakers, who silently haven't been that great since the in-season tournament concluded. For me here, what could you theoretically get in packages from Atlanta? Now listen, I don't have trade packages here kind of filled out, but if we're kind of guessing from the hip, I think like Atlanta, you're maybe looking at AJ Griffin, maybe DeAndre Hunter's in there, some salary filler, and a first-round pick or 2, depending on how the Raptors view those young players. The Pacers, maybe you're looking at something centered around Jarris Walker. The Kings, maybe you're looking at something centered around Harrison Barnes for salary. Obviously, maybe Chris Duarte could be in there. He's not super young, but I think he's a rotation wing, which does have some value for sure. You're probably looking at Davion Mitchell being in that deal, a couple first-round picks. The Kings don't have a ton of young players to offer because I think that they're looking to stay mainly competitive. I know Raptors fans are going to say, we want Keegan Murray. Listen, the Kings are going to hang up on you if that's the position you take. Dallas, they don't really have a package, I don't think, to get involved in Siakam, although I do think they will be interested in him. And then the Lakers, probably looking at something around Hachimura, D'Angelo Russell. That gets the money pretty close. And then outside of that, you're looking at some picks. Maybe Max Christie gets roped into that. Maybe a guy like Jalen Hood-Schifino could be thrown in, their first-round pick this past draft. There's going to be speculation on what players, what pieces would be involved. But the one thing about Siakam is he's a little bit harder to trade for because he's making about $37 million a year compared to their second tradable guy, which is OG Anunoby, who is on a much easier contract to trade for at about $18.6 million. It's a lot easier to match money for him without having to send out a collection of good players. It doesn't take a lot of salary to match money. And because of that, it's a lot easier to see a team being willing to give up 2 first-round picks or more and maybe some unproven young players. And what I mean by unproven young players is, hey, maybe some young rookies who are just drafted in the lottery. For example, if Indiana is a team here on OG Anunoby, could that be Jarris Walker and Ben Shepherd in a deal? If it's a team like Memphis, well, maybe you're looking at Zaire Williams, who probably doesn't have a ton of upside, but you kind of get the picture. You're looking at Jake LaRavia, who just got assigned to the Memphis Hustle. You're looking at David Roddy, and then probably on top of that, 3 first-round picks. If you're looking at the Knicks, that's probably Emmanuel Quickley, it's probably Quentin Grimes, and a first-round pick, and then maybe a little bit more salary to get something done. And then you also notice in my team's interested, I literally wrote out everyone else because I do think there's going to be a ton of interest just around the league for OG Anunoby. I think, I've already mentioned the Memphis Grizzlies, who just got Ja Morant back. He had a stellar night 1 back in the NBA after his suspension. Teams with losing records should consider OG Anunoby if they're confident that they're going to be able to extend him and keep him because he's a perfect fit with nearly any roster. Even a team like Charlotte right now, who hasn't been that great, LaMelo Ball's been out with injury, you could really look at yourself and say, hey, what does a lineup of Brandon Miller, OG Anunoby, Miles Bridges, LaMelo Ball, Mark Williams look like? And you probably think, hey, that's a pretty good starting 5, honestly, especially when everybody's healthy. And I think that's something that a lot of teams could talk themselves into of, okay, if we add OG Anunoby into the mix, we're adding another high-volume scorer, not super high volume. We're not talking 25, 26, 27 points a game, but we're talking a guy who's averaged around 17 to 20 points a game for multiple years in the league. He's a great defender, has been an all-NBA defender in the past, and honestly is playing that way again this year. He's just flat out a really good player, really versatile player who can fit in next to pretty much any single star. So because of that, everyone's going to be interested. The Lakers will be interested. The Clippers will be interested. They don't really have the assets to get involved in this, but they'd be interested. The Mavericks will be interested. I mean, up and down, any team that's looking to make a trade will have interest in OG Anunoby, just given kind of the nature of his talent and the way that the NBA values players like him, which they're very few and far between. There's not a lot of guys built like OG Anunoby in the league. I think one of the better examples is Mikal Bridges, and we know how valuable he is now to the Brooklyn Nets. So OG Anunoby, if you're the Raptors, it sucks you didn't trade him last year, because you probably could have gotten 3 or 4 first-round picks for him, plus other stuff. I think it would have really gone a long way in accelerating the rebuild. But one thing I do have to say here about OG Anunoby, listen, this video is a trade guide, so yes, we're talking mostly about, hey, what could you get if you traded these players? But I do think if there's a player right now on roster that is an expiring contract that they don't want to trade, is probably OG Anunoby. I think that they look at him and Scottie Barnes as a phenomenal wing duo, 2 players that they can see building around for the foreseeable future. So, and listen, Masai Ujiri's done this in the past. He doesn't just trade guys to trade them. He values getting a good deal. And if he doesn't feel like he's getting a good deal, he will hold them and ultimately lose them for nothing if that's what it comes to, because he doesn't want to lose a trade. And I understand that perspective, because you want to do well in every single roster decision, roster transaction you make. But sometimes you run the risk of losing guys for nothing. And we saw it with Fred VanVleet. Now, I think they did rebound pretty well by getting Dennis Schroeder, who has given them kind of some nice juice at times, and he's kind of a walking paint touch, honestly. But I do think with OG Anunoby, if you play that game and lose him, a lot of people are going to be saying, why didn't Masai Ujiri trade this guy? Especially with some of the reports of what offers potentially could look like for him, which again, I think is pretty significant. Trade candidate number 3, and this one is Gary Trent Jr., who I still like, and I think for a similar reason to what I was just talking about with OG Anunoby, a bunch of teams around the league should be interested in this guy, not just contenders. Now, contenders will be interested because he's on an expiring contract, cheap money, $18.5 million. For a team like the Philadelphia 76ers, the contract you'd have to give up is Marcus Morris Sr., and maybe you throw Jaden Springer in there as an upside young player, and you throw in one of your 4 tradable firsts. That type of package is a pretty good starting point for the Raptors. Now, you could argue, okay, we need a little bit more. What kind of else falls into the deal? But for a starting point, I think a lot of teams have the assets to get involved in a Gary Trent Jr. trade. I think he could help swing a playoff series, especially if a team like the 76ers gets him, or the Milwaukee Bucks, for example, who could really desperately use a defender, and I think would really fit well with Adrian Griffin. We obviously know that Griffin was an assistant coach there in Toronto. He has an existing relationship with Gary Trent Jr., and I think he would do a good job kind of acclimating him into Milwaukee and using him to his fullest early on. But you see, I still have a team like Charlotte on here, because I think the Hornets, again, could make some sense. Gary Trent Jr. is still relatively young. He's in his mid-20s. He's been in the league for a long time. He has a lot of seasons of experience, but he came into the league very, very young. So you're looking at a player who I think is honestly pretty mature for his age. I think would fit into a younger locker room and honestly be able to give some guidance and still be a good long-term fit. And then also a team that I think would be a team to watch for is the Denver Nuggets. Now, I don't exactly know how they get their money wise. They'd have to cobble some pieces together, aggregate some salaries. It would be difficult for them, but I do think that ultimately Gary Trent Jr. is actually going to have a pretty strong market at the trade deadline. I was surprised he opted into his player option, but maybe this offseason he can go out and get paid. We'll see. Maybe Toronto finds a way to extend Gary Trent Jr. Now, important to note, there was a change in the CBA with the extension rule. So now instead of the 120% extension rule, it's 140%, which means the Raptors could annually, extend him to up to about $27 million a year, which is more than enough to retain a guy like Gary Trent Jr. in my estimation. So because of that, I wouldn't count the Raptors out as a team willing to extend Gary Trent Jr., but I do think that other teams looking to trade for him would have that in mind as well, and I think that keeps his trade market pretty lively at this point. So the real question here is, what does the franchise direction look like? And really there's 2 options for me. The first option is the option I definitely prefer of the 2, but you have to kind of be careful in which way you choose here. You could either trade most or some of their vets, and I think most is a little bit of an overreaction. If you trade most, that's, in my opinion, that's like including OG Anunoby. And if you do that, you're going to get a ton of draft assets. You're going to massively accelerate your long-term rebuild over, or around Scottie Barnes, who again I have to emphasize is a fantastic young player. If there's one bright spot from this entire Raptors season, it's the fact that Scottie Barnes has taken a significant step forward. He's shooting a good number of threes on a really high percentage. The volume is there, the clip is there. That's exactly what you want to see from Scottie Barnes in terms of his shot making development. Obviously the defense is extremely real. He's just a phenomenal defender, as are most Florida State Seminoles when they come into the NBA. Leonard Hamilton does a really great job down there, coaching up those guys on the defensive end of the floor. But trading most of your vets, it also puts you in a position where you might be a little thin, and it's sometimes hard to actually fully rebuild a team. Look at the Detroit Pistons as an example kind of that. They've had a ton of top picks, and even when they select good players, I think Cade's good, I think Jaden Ivey's good, I think Ausar Thompson's good, it's hard to kind of put together fit. It's hard to start winning games again. So you have to be careful, and I think the best answer here is trade some of your vets. I think it's too early to trade Jakob Poeltl again, just given the fact that you still own an asset for him. I don't know if trading OG Anunoby is the best move. It really comes down to whether or not you feel like you can actually extend or keep him. And then the question around Gary Trent Jr. kind of relies on, can you keep him as well or not? And if you feel like you can, then maybe that's something you should do, and you should extend him and feel good about it. But the other guys that I would trade Otto Porter Jr. if I can get something for him. I would definitely trade Thaddeus Young if I could get something for him. And I 100%, no matter what, would trade Pascal Siakam this season. Listen, Raptors fans, I'm not saying he's not a good player. I 100% acknowledge he is. He's averaging over 21 points a game. He's just really good at basketball. I'm not saying it's going to be easy to replace him. But sometimes it's not about replacing guys, it's about finding players who fit a little bit smoother, a little bit cleaner around your new star franchise build-around player, and that is Scottie Barnes. Do I think Pascal Siakam is the perfect long-term fit next to Scottie? No, I do not. And because of that, I think that you would be better suited to open up cap space, try and open up some other avenues to improve by getting draft picks. You punt on this season a little bit. Maybe by next year, though, with another step from Scottie Barnes, with a step forward in role for OG Anunoby, maybe this team could be back into the playoffs. Or if it's not next year, maybe it's the year after. So it's a short little, hey, we're not going to make the playoffs. We're kind of taking a step back to take a long-term step forward. Something similar to what the Pacers did when they traded Domantas Sabonis for Tyrese Halliburton. You retool, maybe you find a little bit more shooting, a little bit more playmaking, and you put all of those things around Scottie Barnes, and all of a sudden you're cooking with gas. You have a little bit more pace and space into your offense. And I think with kind of the flexibility they have defensively with Scottie and OG and Jakob Poeltl, you can really find any type of player and make a good competitive defense at some point. And I think there's a lot of upside here in Toronto. I really do, unless they go the other direction, which is the keep everyone route. And if you keep everyone, really what it tells me is you care more about trying to make the playoffs or the play-in this season than you do about building a really good long-term contender around Scottie Barnes. Because even though, listen, trading players doesn't make it a guarantee you're going to become a long-term contender, I'm telling you, keeping everyone is almost a guarantee that you won't. The result is likely a longer rebuild where you're taking 5, 6, 7 years to put the right pieces around Scottie Barnes. At that point, he'll be toward the end of his second contract, and then there's going to be rumors of, is Scottie Barnes going to get traded, or is he going to leave the Toronto Raptors? You don't want to deal with that. You really don't. You want to kind of put yourself in a position that by year 5, 6, 7 of Scottie Barnes' career, everyone looks at your franchise and says, wow, they're really well ran. They have a lot of good talent around their star player. And I think trading your guys right now is probably the best way to set that up so that Scottie Barnes doesn't become, I don't know, a little unsure of his future in Toronto, which I'm not saying he is right now. I'm just saying you want to protect yourself against that in the future. And if you keep everyone, you're probably going to be mediocre for a while, and then really you're not getting any top picks. You're not moving your franchise forward in any way long term, and then you likely lose players to free agency again. And we've seen it with Kyle Lowry. We saw it with Fred VanVleet. It's devastating. Losing talent in free agency is one of the hardest things to do, to overcome in the NBA. Obviously, they lost Kawhi Leonard as well. That was, of course, a huge home run move for the organization. They won their first ever title. But losing Kawhi Leonard for nothing still hurts. It does limit what your team is. It makes you take a big step back. And if they kept Kawhi, who knows? Maybe they would have repeated and maybe three-peated. But the reality is they've just lost a lot of players to free agency. And because of that, it does make roster building. It makes your roster construction a lot worse. You just get thinner, and your team over time just kind of falls apart a little bit. We saw it with Serge Ibaka, Marc Gasol as well. This team has just kind of deteriorated, and it's really hard to keep a championship caliber team together. I'm not blaming Masai Ujiri for that, but I think this is an opportunity here to say, look, we rode the last era out as long as we could. Now's our time to pivot. And if we trade 3 of our 5 vets or 4 of our 7 vets or whatever number you want to look at, it could really reset up this franchise for success, put them in a position to keep their picks long term, win a bunch of games in the future, even if it means taking a significant step back this single year. Comment down below, #WeTheNorth, if you made it this far in the video. It lets me know, first of all, that you guys enjoyed, and it lets me know that you watched all the way till the end. Let me know down in the comment section below what you would do if you were in Masai Ujiri's shoes. Would you trade everyone? Would you trade someone? Or would you trade no one? Again, for me, I think I would trade someone, and that someone would start with Pascal Siakam, and then I would continue to evaluate from there. Probably trade Otto Porter Jr., and then after that, probably trade Thad Young, and then I would really sniff around what the OG Anunoby market looks like. If I can get a really good haul for him, it's something I would strongly consider, but you never know. I'm not saying I would 100% do it, but I do think I would start with the Pascal Siakam sweepstakes. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more future NBA content. Remember, this is the first of many trade guides for this trade season. I do hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you're having a happy holidays and a Merry Christmas. Thanks so much, guys, for watching. Go check out some of those other videos here on the channel, and we'll catch you in the very next Utility Sports video.